Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Thank you all for coming, and to you online as well. The innovation I'll discuss today, the frontier as it were, is fairly straightforward. And I'll spend a few slides discussing structural One Health, but I'll be spending the bulk of the talk exploring the political economy that led us to this new approach. After all, what is the point? If there's already a One Health, why add the structural? And if anything, is it anything more than a mere technical advance? The standard One Health approach integrates investigations of wildlife, livestock, and human health in an ecological context. The approach convenes medical doctors, veterinarians, and wildlife biologists under the rubric many species at a locale share infectious, chronic, and environmental illnesses. The approach is not without precedents. Historically, multiple efforts have been made to connect human and animal health, but the renewed interest appears in part driven as by practical matters as by theoretical developments. The surprising spillover of bird flu H5N1 from poultry to humans in 1997 galvanized international health agencies to gather scientists across disciplines to address influenza and other emergent diseases. One Health studies, however, have routinely failed to address the structural causes underlying collapsing health ecologies. For instance, here's a global risk map of emergent zoonotics produced by a number of luminaries in the field. It's based on a logistic regression of presence-absence of all newly emergent diseases since 1940 against such drivers as human population density and wildlife diversity. The warmer the color, the more likely a new pathogen should emerge there. But in treating disease strictly in terms of ecological theory and in confusing geography for causality, the map misses a critical point that in some instances could very well reverse initial conclusions. Let's take H5N1, which clearly emerged in Guangdong in 1996 before spilling over into Hong Kong. But when we include what we've learned about the economic relationship Hong Kong and Guangdong share, causality shifts direction. By the 1990s, the relationship had returned to pre-revolutionary dynamics whereby Hong Kong acts as the proverbial front of the store, providing capital and marketing for Guangdong, the back of the store where production takes place. Indeed, at the time of H5N1's emergence, and by the way, SARS as well, 4/5 of the foreign direct investment through Hong Kong went to Guangdong, including backing the shifts in agricultural land use implicated in disease emergence. So contrary to the morality tale that repeatedly characterized Hong Kong as some innocent victim, Hong Kong appears as responsible as Guangdong for H5N1, and causality moves in the other direction as well. So with these kind of complications in mind, I started working with the University of Washington's Luke Bergman to test whether the world's circuits of capital, as they relate to husbandry and land use, are related to disease emergence. Here we have the percent of land whose harvests are consumed abroad as agricultural goods in green or as manufactured goods and services in blue. In this way, the source of disease may not merely be the countries in which new diseases first appear and may extend as far as the other side of the world. We need to identify who funded the development and deforestation to begin with, as seen here in capital accumulation and consumption across croplands, pasturelands, and forests. It begs whether we might more accurately characterize such places as New York, London, and Hong Kong, key sources of capital, as disease hotspots in their own right. And such questions have a profound effect on the kinds of epidemiologies one chooses to pursue. Presently, we're developing a niche model for the new influenza H7N9 to test which of a series of social and environmental covariates, including connections to our global circuits of capital, characterizes the locales H7N9 has visited, either by direct sampling or by the locations as inferred by our phylogeography here, our geocoded evolutionary tree. In other words, we are testing whether causality extends out beyond eastern China, where the new H7N9 was isolated for the first time last year. Now, this kind of analysis hasn't been really done before, and I think in part it's because research funding can be one willfully ignoring the effects of neoliberal globalization behind our circuits of capital. And I want to spend the rest of the talk exploring why, because I believe that discussion is the crux of the matter. And I believe it's critical to any effort at controlling outbreaks in the world, increasingly of our own making. So, we begin with Earth's transformation into planet farm. Exploding populations of livestock, overwhelming wildlife in biomass, are being driven by the global spread of a vertically integrated filiere by which all the nodes of animal production are placed under one company's roof, from fertilization to freezer. Thousands of poultry and livestock, veritable genetic monocultures, are put into barns and confined animal feedlots. Indeed, 90% of broiler chickens and turkeys are now produced in houses in which 15,000 and 50,000 birds are confined over their lifespan. The new model of production, which originated here in the States pre-World War II, has since spread geographically. In the 1970s, the model was exported to Asia, and companies such as Charoen set up vertical filières in Thailand and soon after elsewhere in Asia. We see particularly an explosion in the number of chickens produced in China from the 1980s on. An explosion increasingly reproduced now worldwide. The hog sector has undergone a similar, if later, upheaval. The number of hog operations steadily declined in the US after 1965, but a real upswing in the heads per farm only started at the beginning of the 1990s. So fewer farms, more pigs per farm, and overall. At the global level, we see the world taking to the new model and increasingly encircled by cities of pigs. The change in the sector is being driven by a declining number of multinationals. In the US, 5 companies, Cargill, Smithfield, Tyson, JBS Swift, and Pilgrim's Pride, parlayed vertical integration and reversals in antitrust law into mass consolidation. They drove their smaller competitors under or took over their operations. According to the Institute for Agricultural and Trade Policy, the 5 companies now control 83% of beef production, 66% of pork production, and 58% of poultry production in the US, some of the greatest monopolistic livestock concentrations in the world. And as a result, the US has lost nearly 600,000 independent hog farms and 500,000 cattle ranches since 1980. The changes in production go hand in hand with jolts in the geographic extent to which poultry and hogs are traded. We see here FileStat data on global live chicken and pig exports by head, 1961 to 2011. And the time series appeared to track geographically lengthening production-demand discrepancy, areas of high production that are meeting demands elsewhere. So we have a globalization in chickens and pigs that started for chickens about 1990 for sure, and after starting wobble in the 90s led by the United States and NAFTA by 2000 in hogs. So what does it have to do with health? The profound shifts in stock breeding over the past 3 decades appear to have selected for new swine and avian influenzas, which now serve as a growing reservoir of potentially pandemic strains. Here, as of 2010, we have a list of only those highly pathogenic H5 and H7 that struck when no such strain was previously present. Those studies highlighted in blue document on-site shifts from low to high pathogenicity. All these, save one, occurred on large-scale operations of more than 10,000 poultry. Preliminary modeling is exploring the mechanism of this shift in virulence. A model by a group I was a part of, led by Yale's Alison Galvani, shows increasing the rate poultry are harvested, which is a move at the center of industrial stock breeding, could select for increased virulence in influenza, even as genetic susceptibility in and of itself may not. A series of Seroepidemiological studies of workers, meanwhile, shows multiple influenza types widespread across the poultry supply chain. Wang's group, for instance, showed H9 across the commodity chain in China, especially among market retailers and wholesalers and workers in large-scale poultry breeding enterprises. The phylogenetic evidence is starting to roll in as well. For instance, the skyline plot on the upper left by Guan Yi's group shows that H5N1 underwent a population increase, a burst in diversity also, only when the virus entered populations of domestic poultry in China. At the genome level here on the right, the series of reassortment events leading to virulence, in which the virus trades genomic segments, occurred only when H5N1 entered domestic populations of birds. More recently, a consortium tracked the various H1 and H3 subtypes moving through Hong Kong swine, including classical swine influenza, European swine flu, the triple reassortment swine flu, H1N1 2009, and seasonal H1N1 and H3N2, a veritable charcuterie of viruses. And the reassortment is telling. 3 of swine flu H1N1's genomic segments originated in the classical swine influenza, 3 segments from a North American H3N2 swine recombinant, and 2 from a Eurasian swine recombinant. In other words, every one of H1N1's genetic segments proved most closely related to influenza circulating among swine, together originating on wholly different continents. And that's a geographic extent and commodity chain no smallholder operation can cover. Only internationally connected companies can pull that off. Consolidation in the sector, meanwhile, likely affects the evolution and spread of influenzas in other ways. For example, nearly 3/4 of the world's poultry breeding is in the hands of a few multinationals. The primary breeders who engineer the first 3 generations of broiler lines commercial multipliers subsequently market declined from 11 companies in 1989 to 4 in 2006. The 10 companies producing layer lines in 1989, those are chickens that lay eggs, were consolidated to 2 by 2006, the Eric West-Johann Group and Hendrix Genetics. Now, the value of the products these primary breeders provide is biologically locked by offering multiplier companies only the males of the male lines and females of the female lines. As a result, batches of hybrid chickens, trade secrets, must be continuously purchased. By this industrial cascade, a single male chicken can generate millions of broiler progeny, largely bred for morphometric characteristics alone, fast breeding, big breasts, etc. The practice, in effect, removes natural selection as a self-correcting and free ecological service. Any culling upon an outbreak or by farmers in reaction to an outbreak has no bearing on the development of immune resistance to the pathogens identified, as these birds, broilers and layers alike, are unable to evolve in response. In other words, the failure to accumulate natural resistance to circulating pathogens is built into the industrial model before a single outbreak occurs. Now, as much as it's a matter of specific companies undertaking specific practices within any one sector, there are deeper contradictions underlying our environmental and epidemiological crises. Yeah, I'm going to go there. Jason Clay of the World Wildlife Foundation has argued conservationists need to cater to 500 of the largest companies who control 70% of 15 of the world's most ecologically significant food commodities, to get the companies to exploit in a more green fashion. These companies are, after all, in the best position to improve on the kinds of production efficiencies needed to reduce resource depletion. And that's certainly a key article of faith of green capitalism. The contention, however, I believe, is at best ahistorical, omitting the wholesale destruction that produced these monocultures, and efficiencies found in producing commodities are often traded in for deficiencies elsewhere, including such overhead as human rights, health, wages, and, to use the reductionist term, ecosystem services. But even as a logical premise, production efficiencies as deployed by so-called sustainable capitalism have long been contradicted by the Jevons paradox. In researching coal, William Stanley Jevons observed increasing efficiency in extracting a resource in the long term leads to increased use of the resource. Runaway fossil fuel consumption proves Jevons' case well enough. And the graphic, and you don't have to worry about the details here, it's not going to be on the test. The graph here shows that as more appliances became increasingly energy efficient, more gadgets were purchased and bigger TVs are using more energy, however efficiently, thereby increasing overall energy consumption. But the idea has been spectacularly supported with respect to food as well. The Green Revolution doubled food production per hectare, but in its after effects also drove widespread malnutrition. In an economic system dedicated to 3% compound growth, better and cheaper extraction, increasing efficiency per unit currency invested, selects for greater exploitation, often until a resource is exhausted. Under the present economic model, the paradox is solved only by exploiting an alternate resource once the original is depleted, wiping out the natural base, species by species, mineral by mineral, and region by region. The destruction, shown for forests at the global scale in this new map by Hansen and colleagues, develops its own perverse momentum. Under Lauderdale's paradox, as resources are destroyed, what's left becomes more valuable. A decaying resource base, then, is no due cause for agribusiness turning into good global citizens, as Jason Clay and others have argued. On the contrary, agribusiness seeks securing exclusive access to our now fiscally appreciating, if ecologically deteriorating, landscapes. Such diseconomies of scale are found across agribusiness in all sorts of ways. Pathogens inherent to such food systems are now spreading farther and faster than ever, including this 2010 salmonella outbreak in eggs across 22 states, sickening 1,500 Americans and leading to a recall of 550 million eggs. I mean, how do companies survive such blowback? I mean, one can't help but quote the political economist Biggie Smalls, "More money, more problems." The short-term gains in agribusinesses' production and supply efficiencies have been developed only by way of a series of costs borne by local peoples in the environment, costs kept off company balance sheets. Occupational hazards, pollution, food poisoning, antibiotic resistance, price spikes, climate change, monopolistic consolidation, declining nutritional content, flooding, land bubbles, grain dumping, farm dispossession, forced migration, research gaps, and damage to transportation and health infrastructure, and I think that covers it, maybe not, are routinely externalized to governments, the indigenous, workers, consumers, taxpayers, livestock, and wildlife. Somebody else always picks up the bill. And should these costs ever be internalized, put back on company balance sheets, agribusiness would end as we know it. So multinational agribusinesses become and remain as large as they are by virtue of translating capital accumulation into political power by which to externalize costs, introducing moral hazards of apocalyptic proportions. Companies can also quite literally escape such costs, engaging in what geographer David Harvey here called spatial fixes, and moving out of areas in which surplus capital becomes locked up where resources have dried out. As we can see in these deforestation maps, they can even geographically surf their own wave of destruction, moving their saws from one plot to the next. Here's a map I'm sure many of you here recognize, but I have something of a different take on it. In essence, it's showing or implying a type of spatial fix that's underway. The transitions in land use in the global south from growing crops directly feeding people here in green to a model around feeding livestock and producing biofuel, now prevalent in red in the global north, are actualized by specific land deals by specific companies. Here we see the 90 deals by which US registered multinationals presently scored hundreds of thousands of hectares for export crops, biofuels, and mining. Landmatrix.org shows similarly globalized distributions for the UK, France, China, and other powers. Africa, home to 60% of the world's remaining underdeveloped farmland, is a particularly active theater, attracting, among others, Cargill and ADM processors. The deals and the structural adjustments such land grabbing requires refute the notion of a free market. As Leo Panitch and Sam Gindin recently detailed, they require heavy state intervention, giving the state a particular class character. For instance, a keyword search of the WikiLeaks cables finds, by my count, 472 cables across 96 countries with genetically modified in their texts. Although some of the cables describe other countries' efforts, cable after cable, the premises of an aggressive business model favoring American agribusinesses are assimilated into US diplomatic policy. as if transmogrified into a matter of international law or even as an inalienable human right, giving the impression that diplomacy is but another means of land grabbing. For instance, we learn out of Embassy Nairobi that the USAID-funded Program for Biosafety Systems organized political support among Kenyan policymakers and regulatory agencies around ratifying a bill establishing the legal framework for American GMOs in Kenya, here visited by Secretaries Clinton and Vilsack. The program also provided technical support for field trials of genetically modified cotton and corn there. Now, the thing is about new technology is that it's often used as a Trojan horse for changes in social reproduction. In this case, rationalizing US multinationals taking land previously tilled by millions of subsistence farmers, all in the name of world hunger. Now, such efforts have a long history, from James DeBoe's African Labor Supply Associates to William Walker's Cornelius Vanderbilt-backed Phalanges and Bill Gates' Monsanto-linked Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa. Capital and its allies have long aimed at externalizing their internal contradictions, all for the greater good, of course. Indeed, agribusiness repeatedly evokes the declensionist fallacy that its practices will reverse alleged shortfalls in the production in the global south its efforts at penetrating markets abroad helped impose in the first place. It appears a number of proponents of the One Health approach, angling for research dollars, have started to situate the approach within a parallel economy. For instance, the organizers of the Global Risk Forum in Davos claim the interdisciplinarity at the heart of One Health must now include, quote, the pharmaceutical and food industry as well as health insurers' engagement, providing significant added value to identify cost-effective measures. The program for the Cargill and Golden Plum-sponsored One Health Conference to be held here in the Twin Cities this month includes a veritable buffet of participants, including respected researchers and governmental health officials. But in addition, a panel of speakers from Pepsi and Cargill and a litigator who, quote, represents food processors, distributors, and retailers in foodborne illness and contamination cases, defending them against labeling and class action consumer fraud claims. Now, this is the first time I've seen agribusiness out and out endorse One Health, which signals its maturation not only in greenwashing the kinds of land grabbing, deforestation, and commodity production that have selected for the emergence of new pathogens, but as their very rationale. We must take land from smallholders because they do not adhere to the biosecurity standards needed to prevent outbreaks, et cetera, et cetera. Never mind that so-called biosecure operations are driving many of the new pathogens, or so-called biosecure operations, I should say. But there is a contrary narrative companies themselves openly advance. In a 2008 speech, Greg Page, Cargill's former CEO, described his company's objectives this way. Cargill is engaged in the commercialization of photosynthesis. That is the root of what we do. In short, Cargill's metaphysics orbits about monetizing and licensing as much of nature as the market and government's absorbing externalized costs will support. This year, present Cargill CEO David McLennan introduced a new plant in Nanjing, China that is slated to process 6 million chickens a year for 45 farms this way. The employees live on the farm. They can't leave because then you increase the risk of disease. Now, he's speaking of a worker quarantine across the 45 days over which the poultry are grown, but it's clearly a plantation Foxconn style that, along with circumventing labor rights, avoids the issue whether raising thousands of chickens under such conditions can ever be biosecure enough given the margins under which the company chooses to operate. Now, these aren't quotes pulled out of context. They are part and parcel of an ethos that structures company practice. Oxfam America reported last year that Cargill illegally acquired 124,000 acres of Columbia farmland in the Atiyanura region in the years 2010-2012. Cargill abused the government program by which family farmers could obtain state land. The food giant combined parcels it purchased through 36 shell companies for the production of corn and soy, exceeding the maximum size allowed by law by more than 30 times. The report came on the heels of a national agrarian strike which forced the Columbia government in proposing new regulations on land purchases by foreign agribusinesses in a country which already sponsors one of the world's greatest concentrations in land ownership, with 80% of the land in the hands of 14% of its landowners, and 40% of its land under contract with multinationals for biofuels, agriculture, forestry, and mining. Colombia's ambassador to the US, Carlos Urrutia, here resigned 2 months previous when similar shenanigans were revealed for 2 other companies. Urrutia's law firm had advised Cargill and the other companies on these purchases. Pepsi, another conference participant, has also benefited from land grabs. Oxfam reports that in 2006, 2 shell companies owned by the Thai giant Confound Sugar pushed 456 families off their land in Cambodia's Sre Ambel district for an 18,000-hectare sugar plantation. By 2010, Concan began supplying London-based Tate & Lyle's sugars owned by the American Sugar Holdings with sugar at 19 cents a pound, although the company denies the contract and claims only 2 shipments of sugar, which I kind of find it strange because presumably there is a contract. They didn't find these 2 shipments didn't fall off the back of a truck or anything. At the time of Oxfam's report, at the time of its publication, Pepsi and Coca-Cola were purchasing Tate & Lyle sugar. Now, under public pressure, the 2 companies have since pledged zero tolerance for land grabbing, including for its bottlers. But clearly, the global competition in which the companies willfully partake and impose will continue to inspire these kind of practices, and practices that, frankly, governments worldwide are increasingly refusing or unable to regulate. Now, there are, however, alternate agroeconomies already in practice that may better instantiate both One Health's founding ethos and its practical solutions. There's another way of doing things. For instance, with the support of the Mexican government, Zapotec Indians developed a certified sustainable community-controlled forestry. Plain pine is sold to the state government, and finished goods, including furniture, are produced in an on-site factory. The cooperative, still a work in progress, plows 1/3 of its profits back into the business, 1/3 into forest preservation, and the rest into its workers in the local community, including pensions, a credit union, and housing for its children studying at university. The Federation of Unions of Farmers Groups of Niger, with over 62,000 members, more than 60% women, offers its members training, grain banking, input shops, credit lines, savings services, consultation, advocacy, and community radio. Previously, on dismantling of the state cooperatives in Niger, farmers there could only consume their harvests or sell them to traders to whom they accumulated massive debt. The poorest cut trees for sale or housing, causing a silted Niger river to flood, worsening already bad conditions with some obvious health implications. The new grain banks cut out the usurious traders and improved food coverage during lean seasons. The farm cooperative shops now permit farmers informed access to quality farm inputs and rental machinery. The Federation's credit cooperatives allow farmers to turn excess grain into cheap liquidity for non-farm economic activity. Another example, Tarun Bharat Sangh, it's a local voluntary organization in Jaipur, India. They initiated a watershed restoration program that grew to 1,000 villages. The organization rebuilt johads, or traditional mud barriers for collecting water that recharge groundwater, improve forest growth, and conserve water for irrigation and for wildlife, livestock, and domestic use. The efforts, coordinated by village councils, restored the Avery River, dry since the 1940s, as well as native bird populations. Now, these efforts instantiate a critical point in why structural One Health is much more than merely a technical advance. If a community's source of wealth is found in its landscape, rather than solely in wages from an externally sourced capital or a small plot's seasonal output, taking care of the land and native and local wildlife turns into a prime directive, even or especially in a global marketplace. Wealth in a commons of population shares, including wildlife and livestock population health, turns back into the kind of value neoclassical economics has long abandoned. Lauderdale's paradox, by which the market rewards efforts to destroy Earth's remaining resources, may be better resolved in favor of populations that conserve the environments they consume. Sustainability arises in part from a communal ownership of the problem of resolving the rift between ecology and economy, including recycling physical and social resources for the next season, the next year, and the next generation. And such communities are almost by definition unlikely or are unable to engage in the kind of spatial fixes routinely undertaken by agribusiness. There's no cutting and running. So my take home today is asking who owns this One Health thing? Who owns epidemiology as a resource? And it depends on a larger picture extending out beyond whether the new approach can be monetized on greenwashing's auction block. In an era marking the end of capitalism's cheap ecology, the end of cheap energy, cheap labor, cheap raw materials, and cheap food, a One Health able to actually control new epizootics from the ground up must account for the structural crises underlying the deforestation, development, and dispossession driving new disease. Indeed, it may turn out that eco-health and sovereignty are indivisible. And if so, the Costa Rican Coffee Cooperative and other such efforts intimate that alternate futures may have already arrived here. What will win out is, of course, an open question. In either way, it'll be up to each of us, and I speak here to the grad students and the postdocs and the undergrads. It'll be up to each of us here to decide which vision of the future you will partake in, to decide for whom we work for. I want you to ask yourself, who on this planet constitutes your constituency? And to think carefully about that. Because it might actually mean a big deal in terms of what happens next on this planet. So, what happened here? Okay. Well, I just wanted to thank my collaborators there. Fortunately, you'll be able to see this online, I'm sure, at some point. Oop. There we go. Thank you. I appreciate that. And those of you who wish to learn what I really think, ho, ho, ho. Oops, I messed up there. I'm sorry. You can go to my website, my blog, Farming Pathogens, farmingpathogens.wordpress.com. Thank you for having come. And for those of you who disagree with me, thank you for having stayed.